Hi guys, thank you so much for attending our second webinar. I'm Christine Ramsey Senior. I'm an assistant professor at South Dakota State University, and I am a member of the Strengthening the Heartland Collaborative. I just want to tell you briefly about Strengthening the Heartland. It's a collaborative between South Dakota State University and North Dakota State University that focuses on thriving rural communities, particularly with a focus on rural wellness. And so today, we're really lucky to have Amber Leafstedt, who's going to talk to you guys about addiction in the family. So I'm going to kick it over to Amber, just so you know. We'll try to save time at the end for some questions. So if questions are coming in and you notice we're not answering them right yet, it's because we're going to get to them at the end. So we're really excited. Thank you.
Hi guys, as Dr. Ara said, my name is Amber Leafstedt, and I want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I am a licensed addiction counselor. I do have my bachelor's and my master's in addiction studies, which I got through USD. I have some experience in the both mental health field and addiction field. During my undergraduate, I worked at the state hospital as a tech, so I got to experience kind of that level. And then I moved into outpatient services for addiction, working with both adults and adolescents. I am actually trained in CBISA, which is Cognitive Behavioral Interventions for Substance Abuse. And from there, I worked with adolescents and adults, and then I moved into inpatient services here in South Dakota, working with adolescent females. So I have a wide range of experience with addiction and serving differing populations. That being said, not only am I going to be giving this presentation through a professional lens, also a personal lens. I, have my own experiences having family members who suffer with addiction, and so kind of know both the professional and the personal end of kind of this information that I'm going to be giving you guys. So let's get into it. So what is this all about? So the point of this webinar, what I really wanted to do was to give some informative information to you guys that would be helpful to either those who are suffering from addiction themselves or have somebody within their family that is suffering from addiction. I'm hoping to achieve this by covering a few topics. So exploring what addiction is, kind of the ways in which addiction is viewed, as well as giving some information about how addiction affects the individual, like what does addiction look like behaviorally, physically, cognitively, as well as how addiction might be affecting families. And then provide some resources and information that are available within South Dakota and just in general to families and individuals with addiction. Now, as we're going through this process or through this presentation, and I use the word addiction, I mean alcoholism as well. But primarily talking about chemical addiction or substance abuse. There are other forms of addiction, such as process addictions, which cover things like gambling and gaming, which are kind of in this as well, but we're really going to be focusing in on substance abuse. So let's see. So what is addiction? There is a long and complex history of addiction, how it's been viewed, how it's been treated. And the purpose of today's webinar is not to fully educate anybody on this history, but it's meant to be more broad and hopefully have some useful information to a regular person who might be facing struggles because of addiction. So please know that this is not the end-all be-all of information about addiction, but hopefully will be informative to you. Now, if you are getting this information and you're like, man, I really just, I want to know more about the history and more in-depth knowledge, there are great resources out there. One of them is Slaying the Dragon, which is a history of addiction treatment and recovery in America. So if you're getting this information and you really want to deep dive and you have interest in reading a textbook, that is a great resource right there. But I want to discuss some of the views of the past and present of addiction, but I also want to be clear that there is no 100% consensus on which view or which model is correct. So it's going to be worth noting a few of them. So the first one that we're going to talk a little bit about is the moral concept or the moral model. So basically through this lens, the drug dependent people are are considered morally weak, and that addiction is viewed as like a fault in one's character. This very much has been the corrective or the correctional view of addiction. Can kind of see it in our jail systems where it's punitive, where we punish the addict rather than we treat the addict. Though it has been a primary view of addiction in the past, it is still lingering and is still around. And some examples of some treatment forms that might be from this model would be like MRT, which is available. The next model I want to talk a little bit about is the disease model, which can kind of be viewed as like a biological view of addiction. This concept of addiction is looking at addiction as not being a moral weakness or a flaw in character, but that it is instead a disease of the brain that is chronic but treatable. So this view of it being a disease has some primary symptoms to this disease. So desensitization of the reward circuits within the brain, increased conditioning responses related to the substance the individual is dependent on, declining function of the brain regions that facilitate decision-making and self-regulation. So let's simplify that. Essentially, the addict's brain has been altered and does not work the same way that a healthy individual's brain would. It has a large impact on their decision-making, their self-regulation. So basically, the addict, especially when using, has a limited ability in decision-making and making good decisions for themselves. They receive a lot of good feelings and good chemicals from their use, and this has them continually seeking out that drug again and again and again. From this viewpoint, we can see and understand maybe why certain individuals who do want to get clean and do want to get better struggle to achieve this despite having motivation to change. Some examples of treatment from this viewpoint are like 12-step programming and treatment models that follow this ideology, which is a major ideological viewpoint from many of treatment centers throughout America right now. I do want to emphasize that there is a heavy spiritual component to this disease model, especially within 12-step programming. And that's kind of with the AANA. So other notable approaches is like the biopsychosocial spiritual approach or concept. And basically this recognizes there are different aspects that are interrelated that create the addiction. So as the title might clue you in, there are biological functions that they look at, such as genealogy, hereditary, it being affecting the chemistry of the brain, psychologically, so looking at mental illness, how maybe that has an effect, sociologically, so their society in general, socialization, those types of things, as well as more recently adding in the spiritual component. And really from this view, they look at all of these factors playing a role in whether or not somebody becomes addicted or not. Then there are psychological approaches, and these can vary depending on what theological viewpoint somebody is taking. So as I said at the beginning, I am trained in CBISA, so that is Cognitive Behavioral Interventions for Substance Abuse. So that is a CBT approach to treating addiction. There are other things such as like psychodynamic model, where they would look at how childhood experiences and problems are interrelated with how we do cope or don't cope as adults, and that these unconscious responses may be influencing the difficulties individuals have. So it's very wide ranging with psychological approaches to the theories. Some other approaches and models are more systematic and kind of influence like policy making, such as like the public health model, which really sees drug use as an interaction between the drug, the individual, and the environment. So institutions and communities might use the public health model to make changes on a larger scale or make policy changes into how we approach addiction. Such as the social cultural model, which really argues that substances and substance abuse should be examined in a wider social context, and that it is often linked to inequality. So as I said, there are wide-ranging views. There's far more to this than I am presenting here. And like I said, Slaying the Dragon is a great resource if you want to dive deeper into what the history has been. So that being said, the disease model. I'm going to really highlight this because this is one of the most widely used currently in the US, and the information going forward is going to be from this perspective and looking at it being a family disease and the roles in the family within this model. Okay, so Why is this important to me? Why is this something that I should know? As a mother, father, brother, sister, why should I know about these models and how professionals might understand addiction? First and foremost, for self-exploration. I really wanted to include these differing models and explanations because I think it's important for family members and individuals to really think to themselves, how do I view addiction? And that this belief more than likely influences how you act and react towards maybe not only yourself, but your family member. So if I am viewing addiction from a moral model perspective, I might be very punitive and just think to myself, why can't they just stop? That they're not wanting to stop, or that it's a fault in their character of the individual. Where if I'm looking at the disease model, my approach and my reactions to my loved one or to myself might be very different. So really understanding, how do these beliefs and views and opinions impact me or my family? When I can understand how I view addiction, it makes my reactions and actions towards that person or towards myself make sense. And at that point, I can decide whether or not I want to explore not only an alternative viewpoint, or maybe alternative reactions, solutions to this thing that is happening to me or to my loved ones. So what can I do with this information? Hopefully this information will be helpful to you in helping you be informed when determining what your next step is going to be, what we try, what services we seek, and really how I respond to the loved one who may be affected, and just kind of using this information to grow. Now that we've kind of looked at how people can view addiction, I think it might be useful to look at what addiction actually is. How do I know if my loved one or I are in trouble? So we're going to look at how addiction affects the individual. So what I want to do is I want to take a little bit of time to watch a short video, a TED Ed video that gives some information about how drugs affect the brain. So we're going to go ahead and give that a watch.
Most people will take a pill, receive an injection, or otherwise take some kind of medicine during their lives. But most of us don't know anything about how these substances actually work. How can various compounds impact the way we physically feel, think, and even behave? For the most part, this depends on how a drug alters the communication between cells in the brain. There are a number of different ways that can happen. But before it gets into the brain, any drug must first reach the bloodstream on a journey that can take anywhere from seconds to hours, depending on factors like how it's administered. The slowest method is to take a drug orally, because it must be absorbed by our digestive system before it takes effect. Inhaling a drug gets it into the bloodstream faster, and injecting a drug intravenously works quickly too, because it pumps the chemicals directly into the blood. Once there, the drug quickly reaches the gates of its destination, the brain. The entrance to this organ is guarded by the blood-brain barrier, which separates blood from the nervous system to keep potentially dangerous substances out. So all drugs must have a specific chemical composition, which gives them the key to unlock this barrier and pass through. Once inside, drugs start to interfere with the brain's normal functioning by targeting its web of neurons and synapses. Neurons are brain cells that have a nucleus, dendrites, and an axon. Synapses are structures placed along the dendrites or the axon, which allow the exchange of electrochemical signals between neurons. Those signals take the form of chemicals called neurotransmitters. Each neurotransmitter plays different roles in regulating our behaviors, emotions, and cognition, but they all work in one of two ways. They can either inhibit the receiving neuron, limiting its activity, or excite it, creating a new electrochemical signal that spreads throughout the network. Any leftover neurotransmitter usually gets degraded or reabsorbed into the transmitting neuron. A drug's effectiveness stems from its ability to manipulate these synaptic transmissions at different phases of the process. That results in an increase or a decrease in the amount of neurotransmitters being spread. For instance, common antidepressants, like SSRIs, stop the reabsorption of serotonin, a neurotransmitter that modulates our moods. This effectively pushes more of it into the neural network. Meanwhile, painkillers, like morphine, raise levels of serotonin and noradrenaline, which regulate energy, arousal, alertness, and pleasure. Those same neurotransmitters also affect endorphin receptors, reducing pain perception. And tranquilizers work by increasing the production of GABA to inhibit neural activity, putting the person in a relaxed or sedated state. What about illegal or illicit drugs? These have powerful impacts on the brain that we're still trying to understand. Crystal meth, an amphetamine, induces a long-lasting release of dopamine, a neurotransmitter linked with the perception of reward and pleasure. It also activates noradrenaline receptors, which increases the heart rate, dilates pupils, and triggers the body's fight or flight response. Cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine and serotonin, pushing more into the network where they boost energy, create feelings of euphoria, and suppress appetites. And hallucinogenic drugs have some of the most puzzling effects. Substances like LSD, mescaline, and DMT all block the release of serotonin, which regulates mood and impulsivity. They also have an impact on the neural circuits involved in perception, learning, and behavioral regulation, which may explain why these drugs have such powerful impacts. Even if some of these effects sound exciting, there are reasons why some of these drugs are highly controlled and often illegal. Drugs have the power to alter the brain's chemistry, and repeated use can permanently rewire the neural networks that support our ability to think, make decisions, learn, and remember things. There's a lot we still don't know about drugs and their effects, both the good and the bad. But those we do know about are the ones we've studied closely and turned into effective medicines. As our knowledge grows about drugs and the brain, the possibilities will also increase for treating the many medical problems that puzzle researchers today.
Okay, so that had a lot of good information about how drugs are affecting the brain, and had a lot of information about neurotransmitters and axons, and we're not going to dive into that. There are entire classes and courses for psychopharmacology that teach that, and but I thought it would be good information to kind of know that the addiction isn't just them wanting to get high, that it actually is affecting their brain. It's affecting the way in which their brain functions. So I wanted to take some time to talk about how the addiction is going to affect the individual on multiple levels. And so going into how the addiction affects the mind. So as that video kind of explained, it's going to affect things, our memory, our attention, our decision making. It can have negative effects on our mental health. So not only can drug use cause substance-induced mental health, so from using these drugs, we're starting to see symptoms in individuals that look like anxiety, that look like depression, but oftentimes are caused by this excessive use. It can also cause pre-existing conditions of mental health to become worse. A lot of the times what we hear is that addicts are using these substances to try and self-medicate, to try and cope, to try and deal with problems that are going on, whether it be mental health or situational. And a lot of the times, a lot of the insight that they don't have is that while they're using it to self-medicate, it's actually making these conditions worse and causing more and more consequences and problems in their life. So it just becomes this vicious cycle of, I'm trying to cope, I'm trying to medicate, I create more problems, I'm going to use, I'm going to cope, I'm going to medicate. And then we get into that continued cycle, then altering their brain and causing these additional problems. So substance use disorders can lead to multiple behavioral problems, both in the short and the long term. And some of these are things like paranoia, aggression, hallucination, seeing and hearing things that aren't there, impaired judgment, impulsiveness, and then ultimately this continued use can lead to addiction. So what about the body? How will addiction affect the individual's body? Well, first, it's going to weaken their immune system. They're going to be getting sick more often. They're going to be more prone to different ailments that maybe they wouldn't be if they weren't using. It can create heart conditions, can weaken the heart depending on what drugs they are using, can cause nausea, abdominal pain, and really affect their digestive system. Chemicals such as alcohol really put an increased strain on the liver, and it's where you can see a lot of the cirrhosis of the liver because your liver is acting as a filter. can lead to seizure, stroke, mental confusion, and even brain damage, long-term brain damage. Can cause lung disease. You see an increase in bronchitis and upper respiratory infections for those who smoke marijuana and smoke drugs. Can lead to overdose. We're seeing a big epidemic right now with fentanyl and with opioid overdoses throughout the US. And ultimately, this use can lead to death, not only from maybe overdose or directly from their drug use, but as they're putting themselves in riskier and dangerous situations as they use. Okay, so as I touched on throughout this, more and more we are starting to acknowledge and see a spiritual component to this disease, and it's been called not only a disease of the brain, but a spiritual disease. So how is the individual affected on the spiritual level or within themselves? So addiction leads to isolation. More and more as they're moving into this culture of addiction. They're isolating themselves from healthy supports, from people who in the past and activities in the past that have been important to them. So they're becoming isolated. There is a shame and guilt component to addiction that kind of keeps that cycle going. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. They start acting out of character. They're going against their values. They're doing things they wouldn't normally do, all because of this addiction, doing things to get their substances, doing things while high on their substances, and just overall see this shift in character, this shift in who they are. So so how do I know if my loved one is an addict? Now that we have now that we know some of the ways that addiction can be considered, I think that it's important for us to be able to identify, okay, is something going on? And a component that I talked about is addiction is shame. And with this shame comes secrets and lies. So with that isolation, the addiction can be hidden from the family by the addict. Maybe the addict is hiding their addiction, trying to hide their use, but also addiction can be hidden by the family from the outside world. So what is going to clue me in that my loved one or I am in trouble? So we're going to talk a little bit about warning signs. So what are some of the physical warning signs of drug abuse or drug use? So these can be things like bloodshot eyes, larger or smaller pupils than normal, changes in appetite, changes in sleep, changes in behavior. So deterioration of appearance. I'm not taking care of myself. I'm not showering. I'm not doing what I normally would do. Runny or sniffling nose, tremor, slurred speech, loss of coordination, sudden weight loss or weight gain. And in these situations, trust your instinct. If something feels off, it probably is. And a lot of these warning signs could be other things, could be other health conditions, could be different things, but it's definitely good to take note when these warning signs and when these red flags are popping up to try and figure out, okay, well, where is it actually coming from? And not to brush it off and not to ignore it. So what are some abuse warning signs? And I do want to note that abuse and addiction are different. And abuse is the avenue to addiction. And so some of the abuse behavioral warning signs are things such as their use is kind of starting to cause difficulties in their life or cause some difficulties in their relationships. They start engaging, maybe they're engaging in secretive or suspicious behaviors, kind of where those lies and those that isolation maybe begin. Maybe they're starting to frequently get into legal trouble, such as getting into fights, having accidents, engaging in legal activities. Maybe they're starting to drive drunk or drive high and do those dangerous activities. They can start to neglect their responsibilities. So they're not getting their homework done, they're skipping school, they're not going to work, calling in sick. Or even neglecting family obligations such as family events, neglecting children, or neglecting their normal caretaker role. Unexplained need for money or borrowing a lot of money or even stealing money. Sudden changes in friends, who they're hanging out with, who they're spending time with, where they're spending time. Unexplained giving up hobbies and kind of shifting in this social aspect of their life. And as you kind of said, starts using drugs in more dangerous situations. Some psychological warning signs might be being fearful or anxious or even paranoid with really no reason, that there's no factual reason for them to have, or reasonable reason for them to have these intense feelings of paranoia. Maybe lack of motivation, appear tired and spaced out all the time. They're not as active as they once were. Periods of unusual increased energy, or nervousness or instability. Things such as sudden mood swings, angry outbursts, and changes in their personality and attitude. They're not acting like they normally would. They're not reacting like they normally would. And maybe their reactions are out of proportion for the situation. So this abuse ultimately leads down the road to addiction. So what are we going to see the difference between abuse and addiction? So some of the things with addiction is an increased tolerance for their substance. So they need more and more to get the high that they want, to get that feeling that they want. So they're increasing their doses, they're increasing how much they're using, they're increasing the time in which they're using. So they might move up to daily use. With this tolerance comes withdrawal. So when they don't have their substances, their body is going to physically withdraw from these substances. And in these situations, they might even use in order to avoid these withdrawal symptoms. One thing I do want to note is withdrawal can be a very dangerous thing, especially for certain substances, such as alcohol, sedatives, and analgesics. It can be really put the person's life in danger to withdraw from these without medical attention or without knowing the risk that it serves. So definitely consider, if my loved one is going through withdrawals, do I need to seek medical attention for them? Can lead to things such as their life revolving around using. So once again, it's their entire day is spent with how can I get my use, spending all day using, spending all my time recovering from. Their entire life begins to revolve around their use. They abandon enjoyable things, they abandon friendships. And the biggest hallmark is that they continue to use their substances, and they continue to do this despite experiencing these negative consequences. Despite all of these negative things that are happening in their life, they're going to continue to use, or they're making excuses for their use, or they're hiding their use, regardless of how it is affecting them. So I'm going to take a little bit of time. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but wanted to get a little bit more specific on some commonly abused drugs and what the warning signs for them are, because they are different depending on what drug they are, but we're not going to spend too much time on this. So depressants, so these things are like Xanax, Valium. They're going to have contracted pupils, so their pupils are going to be very, very small, going to have a drunk-like behavior, might have difficulty concentrating, a lot of clumsiness, poor judgment, slurred speech, and sleepiness. For inhalants, so this is huffing. So these are things like aerosol cans, vapors like gasoline, Whippet, so which is the aerosol cans of whipped cream, air duster. So some of these things are like watery eyes, impaired vision, difficulty with their memory and thought. I'm not sure if you guys saw my cat jump behind me, but so secretions of the nose and mouth, or rashes around their nose and mouth, headaches, nausea, appearing intoxicated, drowsiness, difficulty with muscle control, changes in their appetite and anxiety, irritability. Also, if you're finding a lot of cans that shouldn't be there and they're in places that they shouldn't, that can be also a red flag that something's going on. For hallucinogens, such as LSD, PCP, can be things like dilated pupils, so their pupils are going to be very big, bizarre irrational behaviors, seeing and hearing things that aren't really there. They might become hyper-focused on self or objects, detachment from people and reality, slurred speech, confusion, paranoia, or aggression. For heroin and opiates, so this can be prescription or illicit opiates, can be things of contracted pupils, and their pupils are not going to respond to light, and they're going to be needle points, so they're going to be very, very small. Sleeping at unusual times, nausea, vomiting, coughing, sniffling, twitching, and loss of appetite. For marijuana, the hallmark that probably most people know, glassy, red, bloodshot eyes, inappropriate laughter, followed by sleepiness, loss of interest and motivation, weight gain or weight loss. For stimulants, so this can be things such as amphetamine, cocaine, crystal meth, Adderall, so prescription stimulants as well are going to be the dilated pupils, very, very large, hyperactivity or increased energy, feelings of euphoria, irritability, anxiety, excessive talking followed maybe depressive periods, excessive sleep at odd times, or long periods without eating or sleeping. And then can also have weight loss, dry mouth, dry nose, sores in their mouth. They can start to get sores on their face, sores on their arms. So those are some of the hallmarks of some commonly abused drugs and things that you can watch out for. So regardless of what model or view you take of addiction, one thing is apparent, and that is that it does affect the family. It does affect individuals who love the addict. And that is oftentimes why, even with the disease model, it's called not only a disease of the brain, but it's a disease of the family. And even if the addiction is being kept hidden by the addict, it is likely that the family and loved ones of the addict may experience some of the themes that we are about to talk about. So one thing to note is we talked about with the soul that the addict does begin to become isolated, but that doesn't happen right away. So despite the fact that the addict does become isolated from family and friends, the nature of addiction is built upon shame, and so it's a process of beginning to hide these things. And a thing to note is that sometimes it's the family hiding the addiction or the family not wanting to believe that the addiction is there. So it's not always just the addict that is hiding the problem or hiding the consequences of the problem. But some ways that the family can be affected by the addiction is financially. So it can put a financial burden on the addict, whether that is by supporting their habit, so they're borrowing money, whether it is things such as having to pay money because of the consequences of their addiction and of their actions with their addiction. So things like bail money, things like paying for treatments, things like paying for hospital stays when they do have medical emergencies because of their addiction. Or it can be their own behavior because of their addiction. Maybe they're stealing money, pawning items. Or the family is stepping in to help pay their bills because, once again, as the addiction progresses, less and less are they going to be meeting their responsibilities and fulfilling their responsibilities. And their addiction begins to take over their life, and a lot of the times they're unable to hold down steady jobs. So there's an emotional toll that is taken on the family. There are a lot of emotions that come with addiction. There's shame, guilt, hopelessness, isolation, loneliness, helplessness, and many, many more. These and more can be felt by not only the addict, but the family as well. It is like a roller coaster. And when you're on this roller coaster, it's not easy to know how to get off. And the ups and the downs and everything in between. With substance use, there can be things that come along with it, such as aggression and violence. And so then you have all the emotional complications that also go along with this. So addiction affects the family as a system. So the addiction really starts to take over the family. And so things such as unspoken rules begin to become a thing. Family roles begin to shift. And then we're going to talk a little bit about child of alcohol and addict traits. So we're going to talk about the stages of the family disease. So at first, when the addiction is beginning to start, the family attempts to deny that there is a problem. So there's a lot of denial, excuses being made, justifications being made. And really in this stage, problems are only beginning to arise. So the consequences of the addict and of the effect it's taken on the family are minimal, or they're just beginning to notice, or they're just beginning to happen. It's during this phase that use begins to increase, and maybe these inappropriate behaviors are becoming more apparent. And this often results in loved ones trying to cover up or make excuses for the addict for the addiction. As the addiction progresses, the social isolation begins. So the addict is beginning to isolate from the family, or the family is beginning to isolate from the outside world. So we are pulling back. We don't want people to see the dysfunction. We don't want people to know. So we're pulling back. The use and the behavior is causing significant problems for the family and for the individual. So once again, that reaction is to withdraw. We're gonna the addict's going to withdraw from the family, and the family's going to withdraw from everybody else. This is really where those unspoken rules begin to kick in, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those. Oftentimes the family is blamed by the addict at this point. The family starts to blame the addict, and it's kind of this blame game that's going on. As once again the addiction is progressing, the problems are becoming worse, we're moving into addiction, the family begins to surrender to the illness. So the family has made attempts to control the illness, to control the individual, and they've been unsuccessful. A lot of feelings of helplessness and despair are increased at this point. You know, we've tried and we've tried and we've tried, and we've not been successful in preventing or even controlling what is going on. And this is where roles will begin to shift and members begin to take on new roles. We're going to dive deep into the family roles within addiction, but other family members begin to step up and take over, where we see us shifting to sober families begin to take over. As the person who's using is less able to meet the responsibilities within the family, but also within society of like going to work, getting the kids up for breakfast, showing up to class, those things, depending on who the addict is within the family. Everybody else in the family is having to step up to keep the system going, to counteract and balance out for the addict, for the addiction. And a lot of feelings of resentment can begin to form in this area. And as this continues, the family reaches a breaking point. It's at this point that there's possible separation. There's a major imbalance in the family where the addict is the center of it, and everybody around them is trying to balance out the addict. It is also at this point that something has to give, which we're going to talk about as well. Okay, so want to talk a little bit about these family roles. Once again, this is through the disease concept. So the other thing about these family roles is it is not a one hat thing. Somebody might wear multiple roles, somebody might have multiple, but it tends to be that individuals within the family will gravitate towards one role more because that is how they're dealing with, coping with, and responding to the dysfunction and the addiction. So the first one is the lost child. This is really the family member who wants to be invisible. They want to be out of the way. They really want to escape. And a lot of the times you will find these individuals escaping through very isolating activities. They're going to be reading books. They're going to be playing video games. They're going to be up in their room. They can grow up to have difficulty really feeling and can have a really low sense of self-esteem. Once again, they want to be invisible. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to cause waves. They just want to fade away into the background, which can result in them really feeling like they're just adrift, that they're not really in control of their life and what is happening. So some shadow or underlying feelings that this individual might carry are things such as guilt, loneliness, neglect, abandonment, and rage. For the mascot, this is the clown, this is the entertainer, this is the distractor. So they're really the emotional director of the family. When dysfunction is starting to occur, that's their cue that I need to crack a joke. I need to ease the tension that is going on. One difficult thing with this role is that in the family and in the context of the dysfunctional system, those behaviors are encouraged. They're really given praise for being that emotional director. The downside is that they often will experience difficulty in school because this kid's the class clown, and outside of that system, those behaviors don't suit them well, so they're getting in trouble in school because of these behaviors. Basically, their role is to hide the ugliness of the family, hide the dysfunction. So some shadow underlying feelings with this role are things like embarrassment, shame, failure, and anger. So the next role is the scapegoat. So this is really the person that the family puts blame on. So in a family with addiction, it might not be okay to confront the addict and the addict's behavior, but as the scapegoat is having negative behaviors or negative reacting to the tension and the dysfunction in the family, that is a safe individual to kind of target to kind of shift. If this family member would just get it together, everything would be okay. This family member can also be the most emotionally honest family member in the family, because they are actually responding to the negativity, to the dysfunction. What that leads to is a lot of times the only attention that they're getting is negative attention. And this can kind of lead to acting out. Oftentimes this is the family member first to seek out services, first to get help. They are also known as the black sheep of the family. So the shadow underlying feelings of this role are things like shame, guilt, failure, feeling damaged, inconvenient, and empty. Okay, so really the opposite of the scapegoat is the hero. This is the golden child. This is the child or the family member that gives the family self-worth, because from the outside looking in, they look good. They make the family look good. So they can be things like sports stars, straight A student, prom queens. This individual might even step up and take over a parent role or a responsible role, become very responsible and self-sufficient. They can be the fixer-upper. So they're going to pick up the slack for whatever family member is dysfunctional. So as an adult, they can become very rigid, controlling, and really judgmental of not only themselves, but others. So the shadow underlying feeling is fear, guilt, powerlessness, and shame. So the role that enables this all to happen is the enabler role. This makes all other roles possible. If it was not for the enabler, the dysfunction could not exist. Though I do want to note that regardless of what other roles the family members take on, normally every family member takes on the enabler role in some way, shape, or form. The distorted thinking of the enabler is that they are responsible to fix the problem. They are responsible to heal other people's woundedness. And a lot of the time they become so fixated on other people's that it is detrimental to themselves. They oftentimes become adults who cannot receive love but can only give it. And the shadow underlying feeling here is guilt, exhaustion, resentment, and rage. So the victim role. So this oftentimes is the role that the addict takes over. But what I do want to do is I want to take time to note that this role should not be confused with actual victimization. The characterization of this role is intense self-pity. So they constantly see themselves as the victim. They constantly see themselves as being unable to handle their life. They blame others for their problems. And they often become individuals who believe they have no control over their life, believes no one really cares about them, often negative and distrustful to the point of paranoia. So the underlying feelings here are powerlessness, self-pity, entitlement, rage, violation, persecution, confusion, and blame. So those roles we talked, or those unspoken roles we talked about earlier, are the don't talk, don't feel, don't trust. Now, these rules are oftentimes not even said out loud, but through the dysfunction, these are communicated to children, to family members. We don't talk, we keep secrets, we don't tell others. We don't feel, feelings are frozen. So these are either feelings that are hidden, they're often rejected or annoyed or ignored by the family members. So those shadow underlying feelings that I talked about are those frozen feelings of those family members. So those are the feelings that they shut down, they don't allow themselves to feel, they don't communicate those things. And then they don't trust because the family is constantly getting inconsistent messages, there's broken promises, and there's a fear of how the dysfunctional person or the dysfunctional individuals within the family will react. So here are some childhood alcoholic traits. I'm not going to go through them all right here. I know all of you got a handout. So these are children who grow up in alcoholic families oftentimes will see these traits within themselves as adults. So it's really good information, but I want to make sure we get to the stuff at the end and we are coming down for time. So something's got to give. The family reaches a breaking point, and one aspect of the family role is the enabler, which keeps things going. It keeps the dysfunctional system sick. So one thing that the family has to do is differentiate between helping the addict and helping the addiction. And we want to help the addict. We want to help the individual that we love. We do not want to feed the addiction. And so part of that is learning how to set appropriate boundaries. So I'm not borrowing them money for their use. I'm going to buy them food and whatever the situation is. But something's got to happen. And all family members need to be willing to work on themselves and become aware of areas that they need to change. So these are asking themselves questions of like, what roles did I take? How did I aid in keeping this dysfunction going? And what can I do about me? Because one thing I really want to emphasize is that as a family member, as a loved one, you are not responsible for getting the addict well. That is the addict's job. You are responsible for your own well-being. So we want to support the individual in the best way possible, but we do not need to take responsibility for them getting clean and them doing that, because we want to set it up to help them and hopefully get them to a point where they can help themselves. But that is not our responsibility, and that is something from the enabler role and from that distorted thinking that we have to let go. It is not our responsibility to heal and fix them. So what can I do? So I've got a problem and I need help. So some general resources for an addict are things like 12-step programming. It's free, it's anonymous, and there's various availability. In your community, depending on how big it is, if it's rural, you might have less options, but they normally have meetings all day, every day. I mean, they have meetings in the morning, they have meetings in the afternoon, they have meetings at night. And so really finding those meetings, and they have various meetings. They have meetings for women, for young men, so getting a treatment needs assessment done. So there are state funding resources for both outpatient and inpatient services in South Dakota. And part of that is going in and talking to a professional and getting an understanding of, okay, well, what do I need? So mental health and addiction go so hand in hand. So seeking out mental health services, this might help address any co-occurring issues that are going on, but they will also give you more specialized services or get you connected with services in your area if what you need is more addiction focused. And then helplines, they're available 24/7 and they are always good resources for crises. Now we are going to get to the South Dakota resources for the different areas, but that's going to be the same for the family. So I'm going to go through those. So what can I do? Addiction is tearing my family apart. So some general resources for families are Al-Anon. So this is the 12-step version program for families. It's free, it's anonymous, it's local based, and it's a support system for those who have similar experiences from you. And sometimes just even being able to hear from other families that, yeah, I felt that way too. Yeah, I experienced this. This is what my experiences was like, can be a relief to know that my family's not alone. And can once again bring that out of the dark, bring it from secrets and isolation into the light and connection. Using welfare checks. So not saying you got to call the cops on your loved one, but getting welfare checks put on them. And sometimes it takes an outside agency or an outside resource to get the addict to that next step, to get the addict to that help. In the case of adolescents in South Dakota, we have what is a CHINS petition. And so it's a child in need of supervision. And that's something where you can get the courts and having that outside agency say, no, you're going to follow these rules, you're going to do these things. That can be helpful. Once again, getting a treatment needs assessment done for your loved one and getting mental health support for yourself. So learning how to be able to feel, share, and address within yourself how this is affecting you. You're going to learn how to set healthy boundaries. So how do I help my loved one but not help the addiction? And then learning and being able to remove yourself from the dysfunctional cycle. So I want to talk a little bit about South Dakota resources. Now, I know I probably do not have them all. I do not have contact information for these, but Google is a wonderful thing. So West River, so really the only resources that I really looked into to get were resources really to Rapid City, but that it does not mean that they are the only resources available out in that region. But I am East River, so I am less familiar with them. So these things are like Lifeways, addiction recovery centers of the Black Hills, action for the betterment of the community, behavioral management solutions, and regional health behavioral health center. So for Central South Dakota, these are things like capital area counseling, behavioral care specialists, urban Indian health, and Catholic Family Services have a very big presence out in that area. So for East River, so got some resources in Aberdeen, such as Northeastern Mental Health Center, Worthmore. For Huron, things like Community Counseling Service, Our Home, Brookings, things such as East Central Behavioral Health, LSS, and Teen Challenge. For more Sioux Falls, for the city region, things like Keystone Treatment Center, which has inpatient and outpatient, Choices Recovery, Carroll Institute, VOA, which also has inpatient, outpatient. They also have their New Start program, which is for pregnant women. Tallgrass, Bartles. So there's various resources. There's also various resources in smaller towns. Oftentimes they're community behavioral health programs, but most of the times these behavioral and mental health programs have some form of addiction program, or they're going to be able to get you connected with the services in their area. Definitely utilize your local based mental health or behavioral health programs to get you connected with the resources in your area. So that is all I have, but let's bring it all together. So addiction, various ways to view it. It negatively impacts the individual and the family. It is chronic and pervasive, right? So the family system is going to change as the addiction progresses. We're going to have stages of the family disease, possibly have in our adulthood aspects of this that are going to affect us as an individual. And at some point, something's got to give. So we need to know and remember that there are resources available to us. There is an exit to this roller coaster. We do not have to stay on it. So we can do what we need to do to get ourselves off of it, to remove ourselves from that dysfunctional cycle, and to reclaim our family. So I know we are going to open it up to questions that you guys have. I will try to do my best to answer them. I know Dr. RS is my phone a friend in case I need some more specialized knowledge with it. But what I do want to say is, if there are questions that you ask that I would like to go more in depth on, are there things that you guys would like to know more about in future webinars? Please feel free to throw those out there, because there are going to be more of this. There's going to be other ones for Strengthening the Heartland with other speakers. So definitely letting us know what information you want to know. So throw it over to Dr. RS.
Okay, so looking, seeing if we're going to get any questions in. One thing while I give you guys time to potentially write your questions is to know we're going to have a webinar in March about adverse childhood experiences, ACE, in addictions, and that's going to be led by Dr. Stacy Bourne, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist in South Dakota, as well as a registered play therapist. And then in April, we'll also have one that's specifically about fentanyl. It's something we talk a lot about, fentanyl, but I think it's something you hear a lot about, but you don't always, I think, learn what it actually is, what the purpose is, why this substance that would be so addictive would actually exist. So we're pretty excited to have Dr. Jenna Longren to present about that for us in April, and there will be many more coming. And so one of our requests is, if you want to learn things, please let us know. You know, the whole point of this is to do things for our communities, to try to raise awareness in both South Dakota and North Dakota. And so sometimes it's easier to know what you guys want to know than it is for us to guess. You will be receiving an evaluation, so if you also will put it in the evaluation, that would be great too. I also would encourage you, please let people in your like network know about it. I want to say system, but after talking about family so much, I feel like we should say network instead. And hopefully they'll also access this. And you should also be able to receive the handout that Amber used today. Okay. Well, I don't think we're going to have any questions. I would encourage you guys to check it out again. Thank you so much. Please complete the evaluation. And really, if more things come up, let us know. Let us know what you want to hear about in the realm of addictions. Our aim is to serve you guys. Thank you so much today for your time, Amber. You did a wonderful job. I recognize that, you know, when it's not a billable hour, it's not always you know, a priority. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate everyone who tuned in. So thank you guys. Have a wonderful sunny Wednesday. At least it's sunny here in Brookings. So I hope it's sunny throughout the rest of the state. Bye, guys.
Thanks, guys.